This looks like when I was like a kid and doing karaoke. So I'm not sure how it's going to work. Okay. Hello, everyone. Can I go on from here? Now I'll just to give you a tiny introduction of myself. First of all, thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I remember when I came first to London, this is one of the first places I visited. I was alone, little few friends, and Sophia came to the rescue and made me feel welcome around here. So it's good to be on this side this time round, and it feels very good. So thank you. Now, what I do is I work at King's College in London, and I essentially do research, as Sophia has said, in a number of areas around digital culture. I'm a sociologist, so the sort of usual focus I apply to that is from the sort of social and cultural angle. In the past, the main bulk of my work has been, as Sophia said, on the one hand on digital research methods, and on the other hand in studying freelancers. So freelancers working with apps. I started with a digital app that at the time was called Elance, and I didn't really realize that was soon to become Upwork and one of the sort of major global freelancing companies in the world that has no employees, as a famous internet meme says. So I ended up working on freelancers and focusing on the concept of reputation, which I kind of discussed as a way to think about the way in which social capital works within context of digital economy. So it's going to get less boring than that. It's just to give you an idea of what I'm working on. But
he writes books.
Well, yes, in books that Phoebe edits, especially. So one of the last things I wrote actually is a chapter in this book, which I recommend you to read if you're interested in these topics. It is edited by Phoebe Moore, who happens to be in the first row, and then Martin Upchurch and Santi Whitaker. Within that, there's a number of contributions that look into the way in which forms of surveillance occur into work in a variety of contexts. My chapter in here, which is co-authored with a colleague from Italy, Ivana Pais, is a chapter that looks into what is increasingly being called social recruiting. Social recruiting is an odd term that essentially means when recruiters use social media into their job. So how they use social media to do things. And we sort of did a big survey from the side of recruiters and from the side of job seekers too, looking into the way in which the two kind of match. And we've realized that recruiters use social media very much in a number of ways, essentially in a lot of their practice for two essentially main reasons. One is assessing the personality of a prospective employee. I just had to say, this is the sort of usual white-collar context, so jobs in offices and the sort of usual corporate economy. So in that context, we sort of evidenced how recruiters use social media essentially for two reasons. One is, as I said, assessment of personality, which is an interesting thing. Think about your Facebook posts. Will that be a fair assessment of your personality? Just asking. Mine, I'm not sure. And then the other aspect, of course, is more technical. So to actually go on places like LinkedIn and see if you're saying what you're saying is true. So the way in which your the candidate's skills and education title and all the things that are normally put in a CV match with the things that are appearing online about us, about every kind of information around that. And of course, there's a number of disturbing aspects within this practice. I use the word disturbing because that's a sort of a comment I got on Monday in Lyon in a similar context like this when I've done a speech, and my speech was sort of deemed as disturbing in a nice way, of course, like as in what I was about to say, not myself, hopefully. But the disturbing side is there's data that evidence how recruiters are relatively big, I think, even if it's a sort of small percentage, around between 6 and 12% depending on the region. Recruiters used to ask candidates in job interviews about their Facebook passwords, which is, to my knowledge, illegal, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Illegal in the US.
You can turn back to the recruiter and say no and walk straight out. If they do anything about it, you can prosecute.
Well, I think I would do it anyway in a case like that. That's all, also things that sometimes our students get to ask, and I also tell them, in any case, just, it's not a good practice. You really shouldn't give your password to anyone, and, especially two people, your employer and your partner. Thank you.
Reputation.
Exactly, reputation. And the even more disturbing side is that in the sample on job seekers, around 2% actually said that they've given the password. And of course, you can think about how the dynamics of power play an important role within this context. If you are in the position where you realize that the only way to get the job you really desire is to share your Facebook password with your prospective employer, then you're more inclined to give that information to them, which, even if it's wrong, you sort of comply with some very form of intrusive activity. And I still think that's something that we need to talk to our students even more, because sort of, in a way, to sensibilize them about how the dynamics of power that are in place within a certain, within a context like that, within a request like that, which looks so simple and silly and actually is very wrong, at least from my perspective. Now, this of course is one part of my work. More recently, I've been focusing on things closer to what David has been talking about, and I've been told earlier that I should make an attempt to disagree with you. It's going to be very hard. I'll do my best. Now, one of the things that interested me is that as a digital labor scholar, you start from an idea of looking into the, for instance, things like user-generated content, and how this plays a role in the way in which platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others profit, or inverted commas profit, on the content and activity that we do on those platforms. Now, recently I found this tweet, which I find disturbing, about one of the most famous platforms currently, Uber, that asks us to earn more in our spare time. Well, if it's my spare time, not sure I want to work in a spare time first. And then, of course, I don't really know if I want to turn my free time into paid time, which is an interesting contradiction, I think. They're sort of two completely opposite sentences that don't match together, but they are in an ad that also brings at the third layer on to a technical aspect. Does your car qualify for Uber? I don't have a car, so I don't qualify for Uber, but it's a strange ad, I think, that plays into a number of the things that we've been discussing with David as well, with a slightly different topic. So I'm moving on to work a little bit on these things here, which academics who are very happy to coin new terms because they get more citations, call platform economy, platform capitalism, and these sorts of things. In a way, these are the most interesting ones for me for a number of reasons, which I'll hopefully quickly detail. These are what we commonly sort of define as the gig economy, as you also used that term. Hopefully, for those who haven't had the chance, as I did or David did probably, to read deep into the many reports that have been published very recently about the gig economy there's a number of sources, including one government-funded, the Taylor Report, famously, that talk about what we're talking about when we discuss about the gig economy. So now I sort of summarize this in a slide. One is the idea that the gig economy actually consists in the establishment of a waged relationship, which is a shift of some sort. It's one of the first time that we are developing a wage relationship with a digital entity in the pure sense of the term, between a worker and a digital platform. So, what in my academic talks I call the invisible boss, someone you don't really see, but in some way tells you what to do. And it is a platform that interestingly mediates between demand and supply. So for an academic, it poses a problem. there's a few increasingly rich stats about this small but increasingly important context. We're talking about 45 million workers registered on online work platforms in the world. The most recent estimates talk about around 4% of the workforce in the UK, so quite an increasingly important number. 75 cities in the UK host platforms like Uber and Deliveroo, and more than 500 in the world. And also, as David says, for many of these workers, it's actually the main source of income. So in a way, I think we have a problem. We have a context, a picture in the making that requires us to ask a few questions. Now, I've asked myself one, and one of those, the sort of main one that I'm asking these days is what changes? Now, of course, some of the things we've heard before are interesting, and I think if I can say that, one of the things that struck me about David's presentation is the idea that even more so we are starting to learn that digital media are not neutral tools. Sometimes we tend to think about that, the tool is there and it's for us to make what we make with the tool. In fact, they're not. But they're also tools that can go both ways. So it can be used by an employer to enforce on a number of aspects in work relations, but they can also be used by workers, as your case demonstrates, when through a WhatsApp group you can actually sort of overturn some of the dynamics that are more, and raise awareness around the problems that these jobs have. Particularly interesting, I think, is the technical side. One of the things that the Deliveroo platform allows, which is unique, I think, in that picture here, is the idea that workers get together physically in locations through the geomapping and then the geomapping feature and talk to each other. None of the other platforms do that. And I think it's not incidental that this is actually one of the platforms where we have experienced these forms of mobilization more, because actually, what happens when workers talk? They end up maybe realizing that they are in the same together. And of course, it means that maybe they do something about it. Maybe they end up thinking that there are unions that can help them and things potentially can get a little better. For Uber drivers, that is very difficult because, of course, the social setting in which they work is their own car and they don't really talk to anyone other than on forums. And of course, it's more difficult than from a digital forum to get into an actual form of action. So very quickly, I'll go through why I think there's some interesting aspects to look into in these three categories. One is, a labor scholar would ask, what is the point of production? Because we're not in a factory, these workers are dispersed around the city, so in a way the city becomes the point of production, it's all over the place. But if you think more closely, actually, as in a factory, these workers are subject to constant monitoring. Why? Because they are dots on a phone. They are sort of visible everywhere from this panopticon above them that looks over and can say how much time you spend stuck in a place, still not moving, or how fast you cycle from one place to another, which I don't think is that different from the kind of usual factory-like dynamics. It's just a change of context. Some of the same things apply, and probably we, as scholars, in this sense, probably should start think about that more in that term. And there's another thing that pisses me off a little bit. Sorry for the language, is the fact that these riders here go around with these beautiful suits and actually do advertising for free for Deliveroo. This is also something that I don't really like, but I think it's a different story. The second point is I'm interested in understanding how much emotional labor, what sociologists would call emotional labor, is involved in all of that. So we tend to think that this is a physical kind of work, and it very much is in many contexts, and the Deliveroo example is probably where the very physical activity comes into play more than other places, but there's also a very emotional dynamic attached to it. And in some respect, when you, as a company like platforms, let the customers decide whether someone does a good job or not, it means then that, for instance, Uber drivers have to be nice with you. Because if you're not nice with you, then you can give them a bad review. And then in this way, the platform does two things. It outsources the risk of being fired on everything, essentially, on the worker, and it gives out the job of evaluating whether the drivers are doing a good work on us. And that's not good, I think, as well. And it impacts very much the way in which the drivers are paid and all the sorts of pay systems that are at the back of this. And of course, this, as David has hinted to as well, that's sort of a shift again, because we are now starting to talk about being deactivated, which is a nicest version of saying that they're fired. And of course, this gets into control. How do you control that these people are actually doing the work from the platform side? This has been told as well. Sometimes there's forms of, how can I say that, gaming, again, gamification or psychological tricks that are used to make sure that drivers are productive. This is a famous article from the New York Times that showed how when idle, sometimes Uber drivers are offered the chance to play a game to sort of keep them awake and alive, and then this gets into, of course, more specific practice for that platform, which are things like surge pricing. So you're invited to go into a specific area because you're invited to, in the expectation you make more money going there. So there's a number of tricks that are digitally based, but actually very sophisticated psychological tricks to make sure that workers are productive in that particular context. And of course, consider that, as with the Libero, they're not paid for the spare time. So the work time is always just a piece rate. The pay is a piece rate, so for the ride or the delivery. And this reminded me of an old famous labor process scholar who used to say something that I think is very, very contemporary. Sorry for the long quote. That's something academics also do because they don't remember the exact words that are usually on the papers. That's essentially, I think that the key bit is in the middle. The idea that the workers are easily replaceable and everything in the work process is codified. That's what we're starting to see, I think, with these platforms. Finally, this is a picture that I've seen on Instagram, and a friend of mine sent me from an artist in Bologna, in Italy, one of the most one of the nicest cities in Italy, that depicts a Just Eat rider in the snow. Sometimes we think these jobs are cool, but there's a lot of stuff like this that goes behind the scenes in the real everyday life of these people that we do not think about when from our nice sofas we order a food because it's so warm inside and it's so cold outside. Well, the outside is looking a lot like this. So I think this is an interesting piece of artwork because it makes us reflect, hopefully, a little bit more about again, how some of the stuff that we usually think is so new and is so fancy, and the Uber logo is so clean and neat, and Deliveroo is very handy to use because we're too lazy to cook. There's actually a whole new form of employment that is coming up out of these platforms, and I end up on two disturbing notes. One is these platforms are still operating because largely we haven't, well, the legislator has not reacted enough quickly into getting a sense of this context. So the lawyers that David was mentioning about are also very much well paid to sort of find out where the gaps in the legislations are and act within them. So if we, of course, whatever IWGB does is very important, but it cannot be enough to think about in terms of workers as employees or self-employed. We need to think about how do we make sense of this in broader terms, I think. And the other point, of course, is that maybe there's an idea that we can all, think about in terms of us as consumers. I think the other point here is looking at consumers. Consumers, the key point for why these platforms have been so successful is because they're cheap and convenient to the consumer. And I also do this when I go into places like this and ask the crowd, and I'm asking you today, would you be happy to pay a little bit more for a drive on Uber or a delivery to your doorstep? But sometimes, it's nice to have them, but pay a little more by knowing that there's actually a driver or a worker behind that who is paid decently and has some form of welfare provision that makes their life better. I would, but I hope I'm not the only one. Thank you.